Subscribe to Cheating Tales Lab and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. We hope you enjoy this story. Let's begin. Robert Riley's key turned in the lock, the soft click echoing through the silent foyer of his lavish mansion. The 45-year-old executive's brow furrowed as he stepped inside, the absence of his wife Letitia immediately apparent. "Letitia," he called out, his voice bouncing off the high ceilings. No response. He dropped his suitcase by the door, his eyes scanning the immaculate living room. Something was off. A tie knot was draped carelessly over the back of an armchair. He picked it up, bringing it to his nose. An unfamiliar cologne clung to the silk, musky and expensive. Robert's jaw clenched as he made his way through the house, noting small inconsistencies. A wine glass with a lipstick stain in the sink, a throw pillow out of place on the couch. Each detail added to the growing knot in his stomach. In the bedroom, he unpacked methodically, his mind racing. He pulled out his phone, dialing Letitia's number. Straight to voicemail. He tried again, and again. Nothing. With a growl of frustration, Robert began calling Letitia's friends. Each conversation left him more unsettled than the last. "Oh, Robert." Letitia mentioned something about a spa retreat. Sarah, her yoga buddy, said with a nervous laugh. 10 minutes later, Jennifer, another friend, told him, "I think she said something about visiting a sick aunt. I'm not sure of the details." Their hesitation, the conflicting stories, it all reeked of deception. Robert's knuckles turned white as he gripped the phone, forcing his voice to remain calm as he thanked them and ended the calls. A methodical search of the house turned up nothing until he reached Letitia's vanity. Tucked away in a drawer, beneath a tangle of silk scarves, he found a receipt. His eyes narrowed as he read the itemized list: an outrageously expensive lingerie set, purchased on a date that coincided perfectly with his last business trip. The doorbell chimed, interrupting his dark thoughts. Robert composed himself before answering, finding Mrs. Rosalie Dawson, their 65-year-old neighbor, on the porch. "Mr. Riley, I'm so glad you're back," she said, wringing her hands. "I hope I'm not overstepping, but I thought you should know. There's been an unfamiliar black SUV parked outside your house several times this week, always when you're away." Robert's blood ran cold, but he managed a tight smile. "Thank you for letting me know, Mrs. Dawson. I'm sure it's nothing to worry about." As soon as he closed the door, Robert's calm facade crumbled. He stormed through the house, tearing through drawers and closets. In Letitia's study, hidden behind a row of untouched classics, he found a sleek, expensive burner phone. The device was password protected, a final barrier between Robert and the truth he already knew in his gut. He stared at his reflection in the dark screen, barely recognizing the hard-eyed stranger staring back at him. Robert's fingers flew across his phone's keypad, muscle memory dialing a number he rarely used but always kept close. "Tim, it's Robert. I need your help." No questions asked. Within an hour, Tim Stafford arrived, looking every bit the socially awkward IT genius he was. His arms were laden with equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie rather than a suburban home. "What's the situation, boss?" Tim asked, already setting up his laptop on the kitchen island. Robert's explanation was terse, stripped of emotion. He laid out the facts: the mysterious absences, the conflicting stories, the burner phone. Tim listened intently, nodding occasionally as his fingers flew over the keyboard. "We're going to turn this place into a digital fortress," Tim declared. "Every room, every angle. Nothing will escape our notice." They worked through the night, installing cutting-edge surveillance equipment throughout the house. Cameras in the bedroom, living areas, and all entry points. Microphones hidden in strategic locations. By dawn, Robert had access to a command center that would make intelligence agencies envious. As Tim packed up his gear, Robert clapped him on the shoulder. "I owe you one, Tim." The smaller man shook his head. "You gave me a chance when no one else would. We're even." He hesitated at the door. "Robert, whatever you find, be careful, okay?" Robert's smile was cold. Always am, Tim. Always am. Alone again, Robert set his plan in motion. He crafted a convincing story about an emergency business meeting in Tokyo, complete with hastily booked flights and a hotel reservation. When he texted Letitia the news, her response was almost instantaneous, a flurry of concerned emojis and promises to hold down the fort. When Letitia returned home, Robert watched her on the newly installed cameras. He noted the fleeting look of relief that crossed her face at the mention of his impending trip. It vanished quickly, replaced by a well-practiced expression of wifely concern. As Robert pretended to pack, he caught Letitia slipping into the garden, phone pressed to her ear. Her voice was too low to make out the words, but her body language spoke volumes. Furtive glances, nervous gestures. When she noticed him watching from the window, she ended the call abruptly, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Robert kissed her goodbye, the act of tenderness feeling like ash in his mouth. He drove to the airport, parked his car in long-term parking, and took a cab to a nondescript hotel on the outskirts of town. The room was bland, forgettable. Perfect. He set up his laptop, linking to the surveillance feed. And then Robert Riley settled in to watch his marriage implode. The hotel room clock read 9:47 p.m. when headlights swept across the front of the house on Robert's laptop screen. He leaned forward, every muscle in his body coiled tight as a spring. A sleek black SUV matching Mrs. Dawson's description perfectly pulled into the driveway. The driver's door opened and Robert's world crumbled. Santiago Lutz stepped out, his confident stride unmistakable even in the grainy footage. Robert's longtime business rival, the man who'd tried to undercut him at every turn for over a decade. But Santiago wasn't alone. Two more figures emerged from the vehicle: Andre Ackerman and Herbert Stark. Robert recognized them instantly as Santiago's most trusted associates. All three men cut imposing figures, their expensive suits doing little to hide their athletic builds. Robert's hands clenched into fists, knuckles white with rage. This wasn't just an affair. This was a calculated attack on everything he held dear. The front door opened before they could knock. Letitia stood framed in the doorway, a vision in red lace that made Robert's stomach churn. It was the lingerie set from the receipt, he realized with a sickening lurch. She bought it for them. For this debauchery. He watched, bile rising in his throat, as his wife welcomed the three men with the enthusiasm of a long-lost lover. No, not lover. Lovers. Plural. What unfolded over the next few hours seared itself into Robert's brain. The sounds of ecstasy, the tangle of limbs, the utter betrayal of every vow they'd ever made. He forced himself to keep watching, to document every sordid detail. This wasn't just about gathering evidence anymore. This was about burning away any lingering shred of affection or trust. As the night wore on, Robert's initial shock gave way to a cold, calculating anger. He listened as they made plans for future rendezvous, always carefully timed to coincide with his business trips. This wasn't a one-time indiscretion. This was a well-oiled machine, a conspiracy designed to cuckold him in his own home. Next Friday works perfectly, Letitia purred, running her fingers through Santiago's hair. Robert has that conference in Chicago. Santiago chuckled, a sound that set Robert's teeth on edge. Excellent. I'll bring the champagne. You supply the entertainment. By the time dawn broke, Robert Riley was a changed man. The successful but ultimately trusting husband was dead, replaced by something harder, colder, a man with nothing left to lose and everything to gain through merciless retribution. He checked out of the hotel, his movements precise and controlled. To anyone watching, he was just another businessman starting his day. They couldn't see the storm raging behind his eyes, the wheels of vengeance already turning in his mind. As he drove home, Robert's mind raced with possibilities. Santiago, Letitia, Andre, Herbert, they had no idea what was coming. But Robert did, and he would make sure that when he was done, they would wish they had never crossed Robert Riley. Robert Riley's fingers drummed a steady rhythm on his mahogany desk. his eyes fixed on the business card before him. Faith Montgomery, private investigator. He'd vetted her thoroughly, discreet, sharp, and with a reputation for getting results no matter the cost. Perfect. He dialed a number, his voice clipped and professional when she answered. Ms. Montgomery? Robert Riley. I have a job for you. It's delicate, it's complex, and it needs to be handled with the utmost discretion. Faith's response was equally businesslike. I understand, Mr. Riley. Perhaps we should meet in person to discuss the details. An hour later, they sat in a nondescript cafe, well away from Robert's usual haunts. Faith was younger than he'd expected, barely 35, but her eyes held a hardness that spoke of experience beyond her years. Robert laid out the situation, his words precise and emotionless. He watched Faith's expression carefully, noting the slight widening of her eyes when he mentioned Santiago Lutz. Santiago Lutz, Faith mused, tapping her pen against her notepad. He's got a reputation in certain circles. Not all of it good. Robert leaned forward, his voice low and intense. I want everything, Ms. Montgomery. Every skeleton in his closet, every dirty deal, every indiscretion. Leave no stone unturned. Faith nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Consider it done, Mr. Riley. I'll be in touch. Over the next few weeks, Robert threw himself into his work with a fervor that surprised even his most ambitious colleagues. To the outside world, he was a man on a mission to grow his empire. In reality, every move was calculated to bring Santiago's world crashing down around him. Faith's reports came in regularly, each one adding another piece to the puzzle. Offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, shell companies with suspiciously similar board members, a pattern of bribes and kickbacks that stretched back years. Robert pored over the information, meticulously connecting the dots. He worked late into the night, fueled by a combination of expensive scotch and cold fury. The Robert of a month ago would have balked at the idea of destroying a man's life and career. That Robert was dead, replaced by a creature of pure, ruthless ambition. Using an anonymous email account, Robert crafted a masterpiece of innuendo and partially revealed truths. Just enough to pique the interest of the SEC, not enough to show his full hand. He hit send with a smile, imagining the storm that was about to break over Santiago's head. In the office, Robert was the picture of professionalism. He outbid Santiago on a crucial contract with a smile and a handshake, all while imagining the look on his rival's face when it all came crashing down. Tough luck, Santiago, Robert said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. Maybe next time, eh? Santiago's grip was too tight as they shook hands. Always a pleasure doing business with you, Robert. Give my best to Letitia, won't you? It took every ounce of Robert's self-control not to punch the smug bastard right there in the boardroom. The final piece of his plan fell into place at a charity gala. Robert had done his homework. He knew exactly which causes Gabriella Lutz, Santiago's wife, was passionate about. It was child's play to engineer a chance meeting by the champagne fountain. Gabriella was everything her husband wasn't: warm, genuine, with a quick wit that Robert found himself genuinely enjoying. He pushed away the pang of guilt that threatened to surface. This wasn't about Gabriella. She was collateral damage in a war she didn't even know was being fought. It's so refreshing to meet someone who actually cares about these causes, Gabriella said, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. Sometimes I think half the people here are just for the free champagne and photo ops. Robert laughed, the sound almost foreign to his ears after weeks of determination. Well, I won't say no to good champagne, but you're right. There are more important things in life than the bottom line. As they parted ways, Robert couldn't help but notice the way Gabriella's eyes lingered on him. He filed the information away, another potential weapon in his arsenal. The SEC audit hit Santiago's company like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. Robert watched from the sidelines, his face a mask of polite concern as the business world buzzed with speculation. Santiago's usual swagger was noticeably absent at the next industry event. His collar seemed too tight, his smile strained as he glad-handed his way through the crowd. Robert approached, armed with a flute of champagne and faux sympathy. "Rough time, Santiago?" he asked, his voice low enough that only they could hear. "These audits can be such a headache. If there's anything I can do to help." Santiago's eyes flashed with a mixture of suspicion and barely contained rage. "I don't need your help, Riley. This is nothing but a minor inconvenience. Will be cleared in no time." Robert raised his glass in a mock toast. "Of course." I never doubted it for a moment. As he turned away, Robert allowed himself a small, cold smile. The noose was tightening, and Santiago could feel it. At home, Letitia was becoming increasingly agitated. Robert caught her scrutinizing their bank statements, her brow furrowed in confusion. "Darling," she said one evening, her voice carefully neutral, "I've noticed some irregularities in our accounts. Is everything all right with the business?" Robert put on a show of concern, internally marveling at her audacity. The woman who had been bleeding their accounts dry for months now had the nerve to question him. "Oh, what kind of irregularities?" he asked, moving to look over her shoulder at the statement. Letitia pointed to several large transfers. "They're substantial." Robert furrowed his brow, the picture of a concerned husband. "You're right, that is odd. I'll have to speak with our accountant. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, dear. I don't know what I'd do without you watching out for us." The kiss he placed on her cheek felt like acid on his lips. As the weeks wore on, Robert noticed a change in Letitia's behavior. Her phone calls became more frantic, always taken in hushed tones behind closed doors. He didn't need to check the surveillance footage to know that her rendezvous with Santiago and his cronies had all but ceased. One particularly tense evening, Robert accidentally overheard a snippet of conversation as he passed by Letitia's study. "What do you mean you can't make it?" she hissed into the phone. "Andre, you promised." No, you don't understand. Robert's been asking questions about the accounts. I think he suspects something." Robert allowed himself a smile as he continued down the hallway. The rats were starting to abandon the sinking ship. His friendship with Gabriella was progressing nicely. They met for coffee under the guise of discussing charity work. But Robert could see the growing doubt in her eyes when she spoke of Santiago. "He's been so distant lately," Gabriella confided during one such meeting. "Always working late, barely speaking to me when he is home. I can't help but feel like he's hiding something." Robert reached out, placing a comforting hand over hers. "I'm sure it's just the stress of the audit. But Gabriella, if you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The grateful smile she gave him almost made him feel guilty. Almost. The final nail in Santiago's coffin came in the form of a carefully curated photo leak. Robert had agonized over this move, knowing it would hurt Gabriella as much as Santiago. But in the end, his thirst for revenge won out. The photos hit the tabloids like a bomb. Santiago Lutz, respected businessman, caught in compromising positions with not one, but several women. None of them his wife, and notably, none of them Letitia. Robert had been careful about that he wasn't ready to show his full hand just yet. The business world exploded with scandal. Santiago's already shaky reputation crumbled. And in their lavish home, Gabriella Lutz stared at the headlines with tears in her eyes, reaching for her phone to call the one person she thought she could trust. Robert bided his time, watching as Letitia grew more frantic with each passing day. Her lovers had abandoned her. Her spending habits were under scrutiny, and her carefully constructed world of lies was crumbling around her. He chose his moment carefully. Letitia had just ended yet another tense phone call, her face pale and drawn as she paced the living room. Robert stepped in, closing the door behind him with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. "Rough day, dear?" he asked, his voice deceptively calm. Letitia whirled to face him, her eyes wide with poorly concealed panic. "Robert, I didn't hear you come in. It's nothing. Just some drama with the girls from the club." Robert nodded slowly, moving to pour himself a drink. The clink of ice against glass was the only sound for a long moment. Funny, he said finally. I could have sworn I heard Santiago's name mentioned. And Andre's. Correct me if I'm wrong, but aren't those Santiago Lutz's associates? Odd company for your club friends to keep, wouldn't you say? The color drained from Letitia's face. I don't know what you're talking about. You must have misheard. Robert took a slow sip of his scotch, savoring the burn as much as the fear growing in Letitia's eyes. Oh, I don't think I did. In fact, I think I've been hearing things quite clearly for some time now. The question is, Letitia, how long did you think you could keep this charade going? Letitia's demeanor changed in an instant, fear replaced by defensive anger. What are you implying, Robert? I've been nothing but faithful to you. A harsh laugh escaped Robert's lips. Faithful? Is that what you call fucking my business rival and his associates in our bed? Is that what you call draining our accounts to fund your little escapades? He pulled out his phone, queuing up the damning footage from that first night of surveillance. Letitia's face crumpled as she watched herself writhing in ecstasy, Santiago and his friends taking turns with her like she was nothing more than a toy to be passed around. How did you? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert's voice was ice cold. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I was too stupid, too trusting, to see what was happening right under my nose? Letitia's shock quickly turned to anger. She drew herself up, eyes flashing. You were never here. Always working. Always on some business trip. What did you expect me to do? Sit at home like a good little wife? I expected you to honor our vows. Robert spat. I expected basic human decency and respect. Clearly, that was too much to ask. Letitia's lips curled into a sneer. Fine. You want a divorce? You've got one. I'll take you for everything you're worth, Robert. Half of everything we own is mine by law. For the first time since the confrontation began, Robert smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. Oh, Leticia, you really should have paid more attention to the financial documents I asked you to sign last month. He pulled out a stack of papers from his briefcase. You see, our assets aren't quite as joint as you might think. And as for your little spending sprees, well, let's just say the paper trail leads directly back to you. Embezzlement is such an ugly word, isn't it? Letitia's face went from angry to terrified in the span of a heartbeat. You can't do this. I'll fight you. You'll what? Robert cut her off. Go to Santiago for help. I'm afraid he has his own problems to deal with right now. The SEC is quite interested in some of his business practices. Practices that, coincidentally, you seem to have some knowledge of, given the nature of your pillow talk. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. Face it, Letitia. It's over. You played a dangerous game and you lost. I'd start packing if I were you. The locks will be changed by morning. As Robert turned to leave, Letitia's voice stopped him. How long? She asked, her voice small and defeated. How long have you known? Robert paused at the door, not bothering to turn around. Long enough to make sure that when I was done, you'd have nothing left. Not money, not reputation, not even the man you threw away our marriage for. Goodbye, Letitia. I'd say it's been a pleasure, but we both know that would be a lie. The door closed behind him with a final, devastating click. In the silent aftermath, Letitia sank to her knees, the full weight of her actions finally crashing down upon her. And in his study, Robert Riley poured himself another drink, allowing himself a moment of satisfaction before turning his attention to the next phase of his plan. Santiago Lutz wouldn't know what hit him. Letitia's manicured nails drummed an erratic rhythm on the polished surface of Santiago's desk. Her eyes, once sparkling with mischief and desire, now held the desperate gleam of a cornered animal. We have to do something, Santiago, she hissed, her voice raw with panic. Robert knows everything. He's going to destroy us both. Santiago Lutz, the once imposing business tycoon, looked a shadow of his former self. Dark circles marred the skin under his eyes, and a slight tremor in his hands betrayed the strain of the past weeks. Calm down, Letitia, he snapped, though his own voice lacked its usual confidence. Panicking won't solve anything. We need a plan. Letitia leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. What if we made people think Robert was losing it? You know, mentally unstable? Santiago's eyes narrowed, a spark of his old cunning flaring to life. Go on. Think about it. Letitia pressed, warming to her theme. If everyone believes Robert's gone off the deep end, anything he says about us will be dismissed as the ravings of a madman. A slow, cruel smile spread across Santiago's face. Letitia, my dear, I always said you were more than just a pretty face. They spent the next hour plotting, their heads bent close together over Santiago's desk. By the time Letitia left, a plan had taken shape, a desperate, ruthless gambit to salvage their reputations and discredit Robert Riley once and for all. Santiago wasted no time putting their scheme into action. He reached out to his media contacts, calling in favors and making thinly veiled threats where necessary. Within days, the first whispers began to circulate. Did you hear about Robert Riley? I heard he had some kind of breakdown at the office. My cousin's friend works for him, says he's been acting really paranoid lately. The rumors spread like wildfire, each retelling adding new, lurid details. Robert's alleged erratic behavior and paranoid delusions became the talk of the business world, with speculation running rampant about the cause of his supposed mental decline. Meanwhile, Letitia and Santiago weren't content to rely solely on rumor and innuendo. They needed hard evidence to back up their claims, something that would irreparably damage Robert's credibility. We need to get into his accounts, Letitia insisted during one of their clandestine meetings. There has to be something we can use against him. Santiago nodded, already pulling out his phone. I know a guy, hacker, best in the business. If there's dirt to be found, he'll find it. What neither of them realized was that they were playing right into Robert's hands. The cybersecurity measures Tim had put in place were far beyond anything their hired hacker had ever encountered. Every attempt to breach Robert's defenses not only failed, but left a clear trail leading right back to Santiago and Letitia. Frustrated by their lack of progress and growing increasingly desperate, Letitia decided to take matters into her own hands. She reached out to Julie Brock, Robert's ex-girlfriend from before their marriage. The cafe Letitia chose for their meeting was deliberately nondescript, the kind of place that discouraged lingering glances or eavesdropping. Julie arrived precisely on time, her face a mask of polite curiosity. Thank you for meeting me, Julie. Letitia began, her voice honey-sweet. I'm worried about Robert, and I hoped you might be able to help. Julie's eyebrow arched skeptically. Oh, and how exactly am I supposed to do that? Letitia leaned in, dropping all pretense of friendliness. Cut the act. You dated Robert for what? 2 years? There must be something you know, something we can use to show he's not as stable as he pretends to be. Julie's laugh was sharp and without humor. Let me get this straight. You want me to help you destroy the reputation of a man I once cared deeply for, all to save your own skin. She stood, gathering her purse. I think we're done here. As Julie walked away, Letitia felt the last threads of her plan unraveling. She didn't notice the small smile playing at the corners of Julie's mouth, or the way her hand moved to her pocket, where a recording device had captured every damning word. Across town, Santiago was making his own desperate play. He'd arranged a meeting with Tim Stafford, Robert's loyal IT expert, at an upscale bar known for its discretion. Mr. Stafford, Santiago greeted, all oily charm and forced camaraderie. Thank you for meeting me. Can I get you a drink? Tim's face remained impassive. I'll pass, thanks. What's this about, Mr. Lutz? Santiago's smile faltered slightly at Tim's cool demeanor. He pressed on regardless. I'll be blunt, Mr. Stafford. I'm concerned about Robert. His behavior lately has been erratic. As his friend and colleague, I'm sure you've noticed it too. Tim said nothing, his silence forcing Santiago to fill the void. I'm prepared to make it worth your while. Santiago continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. $500,000. All you have to do is testify about Robert's unstable behavior at work. For his own good, you understand. The silence stretched between them, Santiago's forced smile growing strained. Finally, Tim spoke. Are you finished, Mr. Lutz? Santiago blinked, thrown off balance. What? Tim stood, his voice cold. Because if you are, I'd like to say this. Robert Riley is 10 times the man you'll ever be. He gave me a chance when no one else would, and I'd sooner cut off my own hand than betray him. He leaned in close, his next words barely above a whisper. Oh, and in case you're wondering, this entire conversation has been recorded. I'm sure Robert will be very interested to hear it. As Tim walked away, leaving a shell-shocked Santiago in his wake, the last pillars of the plan to discredit Robert came crashing down. Unbeknownst to either Santiago or Letitia, their desperate attempts to save themselves had only served to seal their own fates. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation. Journalists from every major network and publication jostled for position. Cameras at the ready. The air crackled with the electric tension that precedes a major story. At precisely 2 p.m., Robert Riley strode onto the small stage. He looked every inch the successful businessman, impeccably tailored suit, not a hair out of place. But there was something in his eyes, a steely determination that sent a ripple of unease through the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, Robert began, his voice steady and clear. I've called this press conference to address the recent rumors concerning my mental health and business practices. A susurrus of whispers swept through the room. In the back, Santiago Lutz shifted uncomfortably, a bead of sweat forming on his brow. I'm aware that there have been questions about my stability, Robert continued. Allegations of erratic behavior, paranoid delusions. I'm here today to put those rumors to rest. He paused, his eyes scanning the room. But first, I'd like to present some information that I think you'll find illuminating. With a nod to an assistant, a series of documents appeared on the large screen behind him. Bank statements, emails, surveillance photos, a damning tapestry of evidence pointing to years of fraudulent business practices. What you're looking at, Robert explained, his voice taking on an edge of steel, is proof of a complex money laundering scheme orchestrated by none other than Santiago Lutz. The room erupted in chaos. Cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions. In the back, Santiago's face had gone ashen. Robert held up a hand, quieting the crowd. I understand you have questions about my mental state. Allow me to address those concerns. He produced a stack of papers, holding them up for the cameras. I have here sworn statements from my colleagues, medical evaluations from top psychiatrists, and video evidence showcasing my competency and the calculated nature of my recent actions. As Robert systematically dismantled every allegation against him, Santiago felt the noose tightening. He edged towards the door, only to find his path blocked by 2 stern-faced security guards. But Robert wasn't finished. I'd like to invite a special guest to join me on stage. Julie Brock, if you would. Julie emerged from the wings, her head held high. Santiago's eyes widened in recognition. The ex-girlfriend Letitia had tried to turn against Robert. Ms. Brock has been working with me to uncover the truth, Robert explained. She has evidence that will put to rest any lingering doubts about the nature of these false allegations against me. Julie stepped up to the microphone, her voice clear and unwavering as she recounted her meeting with Letitia, playing the damning recording for all to hear. The final blow came with another gesture from Robert. There's one more person I'd like you all to hear from. Gabriella Lutz, Santiago's wife, walked onto the stage. Her face was a mask of composure, but her eyes blazed with a mixture of pain and fury. Gabriella, Robert said gently, I'm sorry to have to do this, but I believe you deserve to know the truth. He handed her a folder. These are photos and records detailing your husband's multiple affairs, including his relationship with my soon-to-be ex-wife, Letitia. Gabriella's hands shook as she looked through the contents. When she lifted her head, her voice was steel. "I'd like to make a statement," she said, facing the sea of cameras. "I am hereby announcing my intention to file for divorce from Santiago Lutz. Furthermore, I fully support any investigation into his business practices." The press conference ended in a frenzy of flashing cameras and shouted questions. As security led a shell-shocked Santiago away in handcuffs, Robert made one final announcement. "In light of recent events, I've decided to donate a significant portion of my assets to a charity supporting victims of fraud and infidelity. It's my hope that some good can come from this unfortunate situation." The room erupted in applause, Robert's masterful performance leaving no doubt as to who had emerged victorious in this high-stakes game. The consequences of Robert's revelation rippled through the business world like a tsunami. Within hours, Santiago Lutz found himself in a stark interrogation room, the weight of his crimes pressing down on him like a physical force. His high-priced lawyers, usually so confident and commanding, looked as if they'd aged a decade in a single afternoon. They spoke in hushed, urgent tones, their faces grave. "Mr. Lutz, the evidence against you is overwhelming," the lead attorney said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Given the circumstances, we strongly advise you to consider a plea deal." Santiago's world had narrowed to this moment. The realization that his empire of lies and fraud was crumbling around him. He nodded numbly, the fight gone out of him. "Do what you have to do," he muttered. Across town, Letitia faced her own reckoning. She stood in the foyer of what had once been her home, a single suitcase at her feet. The locks had already been changed, a final, irrevocable sign that her life of luxury was over. Her phone buzzed incessantly calls from so-called friends, no doubt eager to distance themselves from the scandal. She ignored them all, knowing that her social circle had contracted to a cold, empty void. With nowhere else to go, Letitia found herself in a small, dingy apartment on the outskirts of town, the kind of place she would have turned her nose up at just days ago. Now, it was all she could afford, as she sat on a lumpy mattress, staring at the water-stained walls. The full weight of her actions crashed down upon her. She had gambled everything, her marriage, her reputation, her future, and lost it all in spectacular fashion. Meanwhile, Andre and Herbert, Santiago's once loyal associates, were scrambling to save themselves. They'd seen the writing on the wall and wasted no time in turning state's evidence. In sterile interrogation rooms, they spilled every secret, every shady deal, every whispered conversation. Their testimonies were a final nail in Santiago's coffin, revealing the true extent of his criminal network. Gabriella Lutz, shell-shocked but resilient, threw herself into the divorce proceedings with determination. She wanted nothing more to do with the man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her so completely. In a moment of vulnerability, she reached out to the one person who had shown her true kindness throughout this ordeal. "Robert," her voice wavered slightly over the phone. I just wanted to thank you for telling me the truth, as painful as it was." Robert's response was gentle, understanding. "You deserve to know, Gabriella. I'm just sorry it had to be this way." A pause, pregnant with possibility. "Perhaps, when the dust settles, we could get coffee sometime?" In his office, Robert allowed himself a small smile. "I'd like that, Gabriella. I'd like that very much." As the days turned to weeks, Robert watched with satisfaction as the pieces fell into place. His divorce from Letitia was settled swiftly and decisively in his favor. Santiago Lutz, once the titan of industry, was reduced to a jumpsuit-clad defendant, his empire dismantled brick by brick. To the outside world, Robert Riley was the picture of triumph, the wronged husband who had exposed a web of deceit and emerged stronger for it. His donation to the charity for victims of fraud and infidelity was lauded in the press, his reputation not just salvaged but burnished to a high shine. But in the quiet moments, when the cameras were gone and the accolades faded, Robert felt something. Not regret, certainly. He would make the same choices again in a heartbeat. But a weight, perhaps. the knowledge that he had looked into the abyss of human nature and not flinched away. It was this feeling that led him to the offices of Dr. Perry Dawson, renowned psychiatrist, not out of any sense of guilt or need for absolution, but out of a pragmatic desire to process his experiences and move forward. "Mr. Riley," Dr. Dawson greeted him, his voice neutral and professional. "What brings you here today?" Robert settled into the leather armchair, his posture relaxed but alert. "Doctor, I've just dismantled the lives of several people who betrayed me. I don't regret it for a moment, but I find myself curious about the experience, about my own reactions to it." Dr. Dawson nodded, his pen poised over a notepad. "I see. And how would you characterize those reactions?" A thoughtful pause. "Satisfaction, certainly. A sense of justice served. But also a certain coldness, a distance from the person I used to be." "And how do you feel about that distance?" Robert's smile was sharp, devoid of warmth. "I think, Doctor, that's what I'm here to figure out." As the session continued, Robert Riley began the process of examining the man he had become, not with any desire to change or soften the hard edges he had developed, but to understand them, to hone them. Outside the window, the city bustled on, unaware of the quiet reckoning taking place within the confines of Dr. Dawson's office. Robert Riley, the man who had looked betrayal in the eye and emerged victorious, was charting his course for the future, a future where he would never again be the trusting fool, but the master of his own destiny.